Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Last month on this channel we began the long journey of looking at SNK fighting games. These uploads covered the original Samurai Showdown game, Art of Fighting, and of course Fatal Fury. As the first to exist out of these three series, the first Fatal Fury game is an important title within fighting game history, as in many ways it can be viewed as the spiritual successor to Street Fighter. This is due to both Fatal Fury and the first Street Fighter title being created by Takashi Nishiyama, a Capcom employee who would later jump ship to SNK. Development of Fatal Fury started prior to Street Fighter 2's release, meaning Street Fighter's spiritual sequel would be quite different from Street Fighter's official successor. Now we all know out of these two titles Street Fighter 2 would captivate the public the most and change the gaming world as we knew it. But to be fair to Fatal Fury, it was still a great little game in its own right, and was an especially fantastic title when you consider it never had the Street Fighter 2 mold to work from, like the majority of mainstream fighting games today. In today's video we are going to be looking at the second entry in the Fatal Fury series, a title that would see release well after Street Fighter 2, meaning that this time around SNK had the opportunity to take inspiration from one of the most creative games ever made. So could SNK come up with a fighting game experience that could top the gameplay found in the Capcom classic? Let's analyse this further. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Fatal Fury 2. The game that was developed to be better than Street Fighter 2. Yeah! The original Fatal Fury game released in 1991 was quite different from the majority of fighting games that would come after it. The game featured a combat system where players would fight across two planes as opposed to just one, and instead of featuring a large playable roster of selectable fighters, Fatal Fury offered players the option of just 3, and the game was more heavily focused around the story as well. The trope for fighting games to contain large rosters of playable fighters was established in Street Fighter 2, and was one of the many features that made the game so attractive to consumers. So, keeping this all in mind, when it came to the development of Fatal Fury 2, it will come as no surprise that developers would take a large amount of influence from Capcom's game. In SNK's quest to top Street Fighter 2, and master the art of fighting games, the company would try their hardest to become the king of fighters. Fatal Fury 2 was only the second ever Neo Geo game released that would form part of their 100 Megashock line. The 100 Megashock line were Neo Geo ROMs that were for the first time bigger than 100 megabits, thus meaning that Fatal Fury 2 was a bigger game offering better graphics than that of the original. As mentioned earlier, the plot in Fatal Fury was one of the game's stronger elements, and focused around that of 3 playable characters. 2 brothers, Andy and Terry Bogard, joined their friend Joe Higashi to take part in a martial arts tournament created by Geese Howard. Geese Howard was a local crime boss who had previously murdered the Bogard's father, so the boys take part to avenge his death. Fatal Fury 2 is set directly after the previous installment in the series, preceding Geese's death. In this title, a mysterious nobleman becomes the sponsor of a brand new King of Fighters tournament. However, this time around, rather than taking place in one town, it's spread across the whole of planet Earth. Throughout Fatal Fury 2, this mysterious man competes in the tournament, defeating participants from the original game, searching for those who were responsible for Geese's death. In this title, that features a simple yet intriguing plot, players, just like in Street Fighter 2, now have the option to select from 8 different characters on the player select screen, instantly giving this game more appeal than its predecessor. We will get to discussing more about this fun lineup of characters shortly, but first, let's dive into talking about the game's combat system. Unlike Street Fighter 2, the second Fatal Fury game once again features a 2-plane battle system, which may come as a surprise to some, especially when you consider they dropped the 2-plane system from some of the home ports of the first Fatal Fury game prior. But for whatever reason, they decided to include it in this one. The game's controls have been modded from that of the first, The title makes use of a 4-button configuration, giving players the ability to perform a light and strong punch as well as a light and strong kick. Dashing backwards and retreating is also possible with a quick double tap backwards of the joystick. Jumping between the two games' planes is possible via the press of 2 light buttons simultaneously. A move known as a power attack is also possible, which sees players knocking their opponents from one plane over to the other. The game also introduces hazards into the field of combat, another element the likes of which there is nothing like in Street Fighter 2. These hazards include electrified wires or stampedes of balls, but can be used to players' advantages by knocking their opponents into such obstacles. In other new features, players can now perform sort of parry techniques, a feature that was not included in the Street Fighter series until Street Fighter 3. Basically, players can guard against opponents' attacks, then follow them up with counter moves known as evasion attacks. Players can also taunt in the game, which is performable with a simple tap of the strong punch button when a long distance from the enemy. Fatal Fury 2 is also the first in the series to include desperation moves, powerful special moves that are only performable when either of the players or their opponent's life gauge is below 25%, and flashing red, overall giving fighters on their last chance an extra shot of adrenaline and an opportunity to turn a match around. In terms of the single player campaign, the structure and layout is identical from that of Street Fighter 2 The World Warrior. As mentioned, players pick from one of 8 characters, then run through a gauntlet of opponents in 2 out of 3 Falls encounters. In between these contests are also a bunch of bonus rounds that involve punching and kicking objects, and in terms of the fights themselves, players must defeat the 8 characters who are featured on the player select screen, then face off and compete against a further 4 non-playable boss characters. To re-emphasise my point in regards to the game structure, it does not get more Street Fighter 2-like than this. Both the original version of Fatal Fury and the first Street Fighter game, come to think of it, both included hyper-masculine all-male casts. Street Fighter 2 broke the trend by including the extremely popular Chun-Li amongst their roster, a character many gamers considered strong and sexy in equal measures. SNK obviously noticed how popular Chun-Li's inclusion was, so in Fatal Fury 2 they would introduce a Chun-Li-like fighter of their very own, in the form of Mai. Mai is a beautiful practitioner of ninjutsu who happens to be the daughter of a ninja clan leader. She also functions in the Fatal Fury story as Andy Bogart's love interest, and to this very day remains one of SNK's most popular and recognisable fighters of all time, who is right up there with Terry Bogard himself. Fatal Fury 2 would be her first ever outing. Speaking of the Bogards, both Andy and Terry, along with their friend Joe Higashi, all make a return to this game as selectable fighters, bringing a huge element of familiarity to those who had found joy in the franchise when they had first discovered Fatal Fury in the previous year. Speaking of returning characters, the previous game featured a masked wrestler named Raiden, who had turned heel after being betrayed by his tag team partner. These events led to him becoming one of Geese Howard's guardians. With Geese now dead, this character, who was modelled on the real-life pro wrestler Vader, would unmask and go by the name of Big Bear in Fatal Fury 2. Since turning face, he develops a much more friendly rivalry with Terry. New to the story, we have Jubi Yamada, a judo master who happens to be Mai's grandfather's greatest rival. Jubi Yamada was known as the Yamada the Demon in his younger days, and he is fighting in the tournament to regain his popularity of yesteryear. He is a womanising, lecherous old man who is infatuated with Mai. Considering all of the parallels, it makes me wonder if he was based straight off of Master Roshi from the Dragon Ball series. We then have a fatty boom boom known as Cheng Sinzan, who practices Tai Chi. Apparently he is a very powerful character, yet hates training and easily becomes tired. Straight away this makes me wonder if this is another character whose influence has been taken from Dragon Ball, this time being drawn from Yajirobe. Aside from these parallels, he is depicted as one of the richest men in Hong Kong and wants to win the tournament to gain international recognition to make himself richer. Out of the playable characters, the last one to mention is Kim Kap-Wan, a South Korean fighter who has entered the tournament to take on Wolfgang Krauser, the mysterious man who has sponsored the new King of Fighters tournament. Kim ends up becoming good friends with Terry Bogard. After all of these playable characters are defeated, players move on to face the 4 boss characters. The first of these is a returning Billy Kane from the first game. Kane is a bow-staff fighting master from the United Kingdom who has entered the tournament to get revenge on the Bogard brothers and Joe for the death of Geese. For those who remember my first Fatal Fury video, I refer to him as Dave Perry. This is due to the character being influential enough to lead to British co-commentator from the UK show Games Master, Dave Perry, modelling his entire TV look based off of the back of this character. Games Master was an extremely popular show in my country in the 90s, occupying a prime-time Friday night terrestrial television spot. For a while, Dave had a reputation of being considered the best gamer in the UK, but infamously threw a strop on the show, behaving like a sore loser as a result of falling off of the snow slide at the beginning of the stage in Mario 64. In fact, whilst on the subject of Dave Perry, as when will I ever get the opportunity to talk about Dave again, he had a controversial return just last year when he launched a YouTube channel. On this platform he uploaded a titillating music video featuring bikini babes playing beat-em-ups. This move left many people scratching their heads, particularly those who consider themselves somewhat progressive. The publication Eurogamer would even go as far as to write a hit piece on him afterwards, attempting to virtual signal by shining a light on his misogyny. This would result in him appearing to play the role of a heel in later interviews, claiming he planned the whole thing to get a reaction out of stupid people. All in all, he is probably my country's closest thing to a Billy Mitchell, so I thought his tale would be fun to quickly share with you here. Let me know in the comment section if you would like me to seek this man out in the future for a fun shoot interview down the line. In terms of Fatal Fury bosses, next we have Axel Hawk, a retired professional boxer who has made a comeback after being invited to the tournament. Between his career and the comeback, he reportedly spent all of his time playing with remote control cars whilst being supported by his elderly mother. His stage is the one with electrified wires around the ring ropes. The next contest that takes place is against Lawrence Blood, and there is also obstacles in this stage, this time featuring the bulls. As expected, with such a stage backdrop, Lawrence is a former matador. He uses a self-styled martial art based on his deadly bullfighting methods, and serves as a right-hand man to Krauser, the tournament's sponsor. Speaking of Krauser, the game's final fight takes place against Wolfgang Krauser himself, a man who is said to be the only man in the world whom Geese Howard deeply feared. This German nobleman comes from a prestigious family in Europe, but is considered a ruthless warlord within the criminal underworld, carrying the nickname the Emperor of Darkness. Krauser announced the tournament specifically to lure in Terry and his brother along with Joe Higashi. In later games, more is revealed about Krauser, which we shall get into in future videos. Apart from this fantastic lineup of fighters, one thing I have not yet commented on, which perhaps I should, is how beautiful the stage backdrops look within Fatal Fury 2. They all feature multi-layer scrolling, which the programmers have emphasised further by placing stages on a train, boat and raft to help maximise the movement in the background. The game graphically really does look like a huge step forward from its predecessor just 1 year earlier, and in my opinion is even better looking than Street Fighter 2 itself. After the game's arcade release, the title will be trickled out to see releases on a variety of home formats in the next few years. This would include versions of the game for Neo Geo's own home hardware, such as the Neo Geo AES and Neo Geo CD systems, as well as ports to the Sharp X68000, the fantastic Japanese-only home computer format. The game would also be ported over to the Mega Drive, PC Engine CD, Super Nintendo and even the Game Boy, but obviously none of these ports were close to the game that could be found on Neo Geo hardware, which is what you would expect really. It is of note though that some of these versions of the game allowed players to control the boss characters by entering special codes, so at least there is that. In terms of how each of these were received, the original arcade version of the game was strongly praised by critics. GamePro loved the action-packed gameplay, and they described it as a Street Fighter tough challenge. They would also go on to praise the characters, character graphic animations, sound and slick scrolling backgrounds. They concluded that Fatal Fury 2 was an awesome sequel that ranks up there with the numero uno fighting game. In terms of the Mega Drive port, it too would receive a fair share of praise, particularly for its graphics and 6-button support. GamePro said it faithfully mimics the Neo Geo version and knocks Fatal Fury's original Mega Drive version out of the ring. EGM would also praise the SNES version, declaring it one of the better fighting games on the system. GamePro were less impressed though, comparing it favourably with its predecessor, but stating that the graphics are inferior to the Neo Geo version, the audio is terrible, the controls are unreliable, and the gameplay is unbalanced. To summarise my thoughts on Fatal Fury 2, and whether or not SNK managed to create a game that was better than that of Street Fighter 2, it is certainly up for debate. SNK certainly took some elements from Capcom's game and included it in their latest title, such as the inclusion of 8 playable fighters and 4 boss characters, and Mai certainly offered a good alternative to Chun-Li. Despite these changes, Fatal Fury retained some of its own elements to separate it, such as the 2-plane combat and the return of memorable characters and story elements. New features such as desperation moves would also add to the game's strategy, and the graphics and artwork in the game are fantastic. SNK would certainly mix a bunch of old and new features up with the Capcom Street Fighter 2 formula to create a novel game. Regardless of all of SNK's best efforts, Fatal Fury 2 was not the most memorable game of 1992 fighting game wise, and after not one but 2 revisions to the original Street Fighter 2 game, a new edition of Street Fighter 2 closed out that year, retaining Street Fighter's crown as the King of Fighters. In the latest edition of the game, Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting, not only could gamers now select any of the original game's bosses, bringing the playable roster count up to 12, but new moves had also been included, and gameplay had been sped up exponentially to improve the level of fun Street Fighter 2 could deliver. Amusingly, the version of Street Fighter 2 that almost undisputedly topped the Fatal Fury 2 experience was not really even engineered by Capcom, but instead the game's release was in response to the wave of bootleg ROMs that had been illegally included in arcade cabinets, adding new gameplay and speeding up the action, thus prompting Capcom to officially respond to this. There is no doubt in my mind that Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting is the greatest fighting game released in 1992. But Fatal Fury 2 certainly gives the original version of the title, The World Warrior, a run for its money, and regardless of any comparisons made today, Fatal Fury 2 was a fantastic little game, which at a later date would go on to receive a Street Fighter style upgrade of its very own. But that is a story for another time, when I bring to you a special video. Today though just featured the story of Fatal Fury 2, but if you want to see future uploads covering the rest of the series, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay notified. I also have a huge backlog of fighting game historical retrospectives for you to go back and enjoy. Let me know in the comment section which fighting game you would like to see me cover next. Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout out at the end of these videos. These people make working full time on YouTube just that little bit less scary, so I'd like to thank all of you very much for that. Huge shout outs go out to Carl Johnson, Sebastian Velez, SpongeMat BYT, House of the Ted, Daniel Daly, Synth Spaces, Andrew Bazanski, Asobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, RetroVersion.com, Dan Barlow Jr., Joel, Me Machine Dean, and all of my other patrons. Yeah!